this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude. Today reviewing this sword from Swordier. Now they called it the Lion King, but it's not available on their website anymore. The listing is gone. So I'm going off memory here with the Lion King, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. In addition, I don't remember the exact price that this sword sold for because the listing is gone. I think it was around $250. Now, this is not my sword. This is a loaner from sword friend Frank. So first off, a big thank you to Frank for loaning me this sword, and an even bigger thank you for allowing me to hold on to it for too many months at this point. But I am finally getting around to getting this reviewed. Now, sword friend Frank wanted me to review this sword because when he had it sent to me, Swordier was still pretty new on the scene. They're still pretty new on the scene, but even newer then. He wanted to make sure that they deliver a sword. He was concerned that they were going to ship me an empty box. But no, they did actually send this sword. The other big reason Frank wanted me to review this sword is because he had done some research and had seen what looks like this exact sword available on a variety of sites besides Swordier. And here's two examples, one being AliExpress and the other being eBay. Now, the first thing that pops out to me on those listings is the price difference. Those are around $450. Swordier had this at $250. So that's a big difference. And Frank just really wanted to know, is this a decent sword? And to get word out there about whether or not this sword is decent and whether or not Swordier can be trusted. So going off those various listings, along with Swordier's website, what they sell, I think it's very, very clear that this sword is made in Longchuan, China, and is a Chinese interpretation of a European longsword. So this sword does come with a wood core scabbard, and it is wrapped in what I believe is some kind of imitation leather. It doesn't have the feel of actual leather, but it certainly does look the part. It has a design etched into it here, metal shape, some suspension. The suspension points here are made of a very soft material that again does not feel like real leather, and it has a belt as well that feels exactly the same. The fit here is pretty good. There's only a little bit of rattle in a couple areas and only when shaken in certain directions. It's a pretty good fit. If I hold it upside down, it slides right out though. So it doesn't have a ton of retention. If I put it in the other way, still doesn't really have much rattle. Still slides right out. It's a decent fit, could be a tiny bit tighter, but I think this is a perfectly good fit, and it's better for it to be a little bit loose than a little bit too tight. Honestly, what I think is most interesting about this scabbard is what they used to refine the fit, because it's, like I said, it's wood core, but there's a piece of ray skin probably glued to the wood core here to refine the fit. I've never seen that before. I've certainly seen scabbards that have like a wood shim. I've seen some that have leather. I've seen some that have plastic, but I've never seen ray skin before. So I don't think that really is particularly important. It's just something I noticed and thought was, that's interesting. Now, I would like to see the scabbard made with real leather as opposed to this kind of cheap feeling imitation leather, but at the price point that this sword was sold at, around $250, I don't think you can really ask for much more than a functional scabbard, if even that. So this is definitely functional, so that's good enough. Moving on to the hilt, I'm going to start with what is my favorite part of this sword, and also something that I have a fairly large complaint about it. That's the grip. I love the shape of this grip. It is octagonal in cross section, and every time I pick it up, it just feels great. I love octagonal grip cross sections, especially when they are octagonal here and then transition into a cylindrical here, which is exactly what this does. This is a really well done shaping of the grip. What is my complaint that I mentioned? Frankly, the grip is too long. I'm going to get into that more during the handling section though. So this is also not covered in leather. This is a cord wrap. The cord is very nice feeling, better than I was expecting it to feel. And it has this metal spacer here that while it sticks out over the cord wrap, it's rounded over perfectly. There's no hot spot here. This is not really historical, but to my knowledge at least, but then this whole sword is not really historical, so that's not a big deal. Like I said, I absolutely love this grip's shape, the way it feels, and it gives me a very secure grip as well. It locks into my hand very easily. I can't rotate it, and it indexes the edge very well. The one thing I find a little bit odd about the shaping here is that the grip transitions from the octagonal into the cylindrical shape right about here. I don't know why they didn't put the riser right, or the spacer right there. It seems to me a little weird to put it after that transition starts. I would expect to put it right at the transition. It doesn't really affect anything. It just, when I look at it and it catches my eye that that's where the transition is, it looks weird having the spacer in a different spot from that. Now the pommel on here is probably the most historically accurate piece of hardware and just overall design of this sword. It is inspired by the scent stopper family of pommels. I like this pommel quite a bit. It's finished quite nicely in a satin that is, there's still some grind lines visible, and if you look closely, not everything is lined up perfectly, but again, budget sword, you can't really expect that. The transitions to the cord wrap, absolutely perfect. The cord wrap overlaps all the little facets here, so there's no hot spots at all. Now, one thing that's really interesting is each facet is actually very slightly hollow ground. That's a lot of detail and effort put into this shaping here. You would normally see these facets be basically flat right here, but it's actually got a groove. It's hollow ground. So there's a lot of attention to detail that went into this pommel, and it shows. It's a very attractive pommel to my eye. The pommel is also peened to the tang. The peen is rectangular, not rounded, and it's pretty well done. I don't see any errant hammer marks. There are what looks like some black spots underneath it that look like they are gaps, but they're not. I can't get anything in there. I took a toothpick and tried inserting it in there to make sure that's not a gap where the peen is not covering over the hole in the pommel. It's not. It's probably just a finish that didn't get polished up because of the peen. So overall, I do like this pommel, and it works really well to help stop the hand from sliding off the grip. Now the crossguard on here is a bit of fantasy. There's not really any crossguards from history that have this overall shape that I'm aware of. Of course, I am no expert in that. I wouldn't be surprised if there was one that I'm aware of, but it certainly doesn't conform to the norms from historical European swords. That's not to say it's bad. It's only got a little bit of flares and spots. The overall geometry could be refined some. It's basically a flat bar that has a little bit of flare on each side, and then these little flares here. I don't know how to describe that. It's kind of interesting how there's a groove right here, which actually works really well for putting your thumb on the blade, which is a technique that a lot of historical European martial arts use, especially the German style of fencing. So it's cool that that's there, and it's nice because there's makers that try to do historical European swords that don't understand that technique and don't account for being able to thumb the blade. And here we have a Chinese designed and made sword that accommodates that. So that's good to see. The finish on here is pretty much the same as the pommel. It's a satin with some grind lines visible. Nothing particularly noteworthy about that. What is noteworthy is the way the sword sits in the crossguard and the gap and all that. This is a little bit odd. What it looks like to me is that there's a very, very shallow recess where the very edges of the blade the shoulders of the blade rest, very shallow. And then there's a much bigger recess for where the tang goes through. But it's not particularly fitted that well from what I can tell. When I look at it, I can see epoxy in there. And I'm a little concerned about the way it sits in the crossguard. I don't think the shoulders should be that shallow in the crossguard. It would be nice to have them sunk in a little bit more and have everything just tweaked a little bit to fit the shape of the blade a little bit. But again, budget-oriented sword, $250. It's not terrible. It feels very solid. I haven't had any kind of issues with it coming loose or anything like that. There's a little bit of ring to the sword, but not a whole lot. So that's probably the epoxy muting the ring a little bit. But overall, it seems okay. It's just something that I think with a little bit more hard use than I tend to do, that might be a problem, but that's speculation. I don't know because that's not my jam. I don't do abusive tests on swords. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So this sword starts quite thick at 8 millimeters thick, and in the first 12 inches tapers almost a full 3 millimeters before gently slowing down that taper down to right around 3 millimeters at the tip. That's a pretty good amount of distal taper and pretty well shaped, although I did notice something odd. There is a dip in the blade in the center ridge right here. Pretty much well, you might be able to see that there. It's really hard to get the camera to focus, and it's not really noticeable by sight, but there is definitely a dip in the thickness right here on this side, not on this side. So that's a bit of a grinding error. I don't think it's much of a problem because the blade's still pretty thick here, but it is something that I noticed. At the price point that this sword sells for, $250, if you get it from Swordier, if they still had it listed, that's not a problem. So one of the most immediately obvious things about this sword is that it is made of pattern welded steel. It's got a very prominent pattern on it. I do not know what the component steels are. Maybe if Swordier still had the listing up, maybe they would list it. Although really, I think only LK Chen goes to much detail about what the steels that go into their pattern welding is. I will say that this looks fairly similar to LK Chen's pattern welded steel, and my hunch, it's something pretty similar because the LK Chen stuff is made in Longshuan. This was made in Longshuan. Now, I'm not saying this is made by LK Chen or anything like that. Don't get me wrong. Just saying it's probably somewhat similar, just as a hunch. Now, I've said several times through this review that this sword doesn't really represent a European longsword, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the blade itself. And I'm going to touch on why that is only kind of briefly, because while this was sold as a European longsword, at the price point it was sold at, historical accuracy tends to go out the window a little bit. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad sword just because it doesn't adhere to historical norms. So the first thing that is pretty much not really seen on historical longswords is this cross-section. I'm going to interrupt myself here and state that I should not have used not seen, because there is a huge variety of swords from the medieval period, and no doubt some of them had a similar cross-section. But this is not really the norm for most historic medieval swords. This is a hollow ground blade with a very prominent center ridge, and then swells back up towards the edge, and then has a very shallow bevel to the actual edge. This is very reminiscent of Chinese jian, not European swords. In addition, the tip looks like a jian tip, not really like a European longsword tip. So the overall look of it, the way it moves around, all of that, it really does feel to me like a Chinese jian mounted to a European style hilt. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, just something for you to be aware of. If you're interested in this as a European sword, it doesn't really fit that other than in a very superficial manner. Looking at the sword itself, it's got a very bright polish that is approaching mirror, even with the pattern welding on it. There's quite a bit of rippling on the surface of the blade, and they don't really seem to be that deep, except for that one dip that I mentioned earlier. And again, I don't think that's an issue. The edge bevel is quite nice. One smooth bevel to the edge. It is apple-seated a little bit, but it is a very shallow bevel, so it's a pretty obtuse angle to the edge. All right, let's test the edges on some paper. As always, this is more about providing information of how sharp the sword is so that you can put that in context when you see the cutting. Less about what it actually does, more about comparing it to other swords that I've reviewed. So it completely failed to bite into the edge there. Yeah, it is not able to bite into the edge of the paper at all. Once I insert it in and draw it through, though, it cuts cleanly. So it's even edge. It's got a little bit of tearing, but that's mostly a smooth, even draw through the paper. It just doesn't have that level of sharpness that's required to cut into the edge of paper, which is really that final level of sharpening that a lot of makers fail on. Or fail on is the wrong term. A lot of makers don't put that final level of sharpening into their swords, and it looks like, at least on that edge, that's the case here. So here is the other edge. Same result. Yeah. So to me, it looks like this edge is just not quite finished to my standards. Very smooth once it gets into the paper, but it lacks that final apexing of the edge to get it to be able to bite into. Cutting with this sword. Now, I didn't do very much cutting. It is just way too hot, but I did get out there for one session, and this sword cuts okay. It's maybe a little bit worse than okay. It does cut, it's sharp enough to cut, but it also is not really designed to be much of a cutter. There's not a whole lot of blade presence. I'll talk about that during handling. And the edge geometry is just not really designed for cutting. First off, it's not really apexed to get that first initial bite into targets. So it is relying on the geometry after that. And the geometry here is not really designed for cutting either. It's a very shallow bevel. There's not very much room for the edge to develop. You know, if you have a longer bevel, it can be a more acute angle. Because this is such a short bevel, it has to be more obtuse, and therefore it's not going to be as conducive to cutting. And I did feel that combination of things when I was trying to cut. I was able to get through targets, but a lot of the time, the targets started tearing, they started flying around. They just didn't feel good to cut. I didn't get really much in the way of any clean cuts. Even when I got all the way through, they usually ended up scooping a little bit or just flying around. Part of that probably is my technique, but a lot of it is that the way this sword transferred the force caused the target to start moving around during the cut, which then makes the sword move some, and you end up with a pretty bad cut. And that's kind of what I got with most of my cutting with this sword. I don't even think that adding a particularly sharper edge would do a lot here. It would certainly help. It would get that initial bite into the target better, but the geometry here is just really not particularly conducive to good, clean cuts. That's not to say it can't do it, just not in my hands with the level of sharpness. Again, I don't think that sharpening would really do a whole lot. It would aid it, but it would not turn this into an excellent cutter, in my opinion. All right, handling. So let's first dive right into what I mentioned earlier during the hilt section, why I feel like this grip is a little too long. With a blade that is relatively short at around 31 inches, The grip is 9 inches. That is long for that length of a blade. And it makes it feel a little bit weird to my taste, to the way I've handled it. It brings the point of balance back very close to the guard. It's at about 1.5 inches, if I remember right. 1 to 1.5 inches. Very closely balanced to the cross guard, which makes this more of a thrust-focused sword. And yeah, you can definitely put the tip where you want it and maneuver the tip very easily. But it feels just a little bit weird. What is interesting to me is when I've been moving this sword around and just handling it and practicing with it, the sword it kept reminding me of is the LK Chen, I believe it's the Flying Phoenix that I did a video on some time ago. That really long jian with a really long hilt. This sword reminds me of that. It's got this just really long grip where I can do, I can bunch my hands up, I can separate them a little, or I can separate them a lot to change the lever points. But the thing is, none of the lever points to me really feel quite right for a European longsword. I think that's a combination of that short blade and a hilt that is pretty hefty with a big pommel, a long grip, and then a pretty normal size and weight crossguard. It just makes it feel a little bit, there's very little blade presence here, first off. I barely feel much anything out here. Most of the weight when I pick this up, most of the weight I'm feeling is the pommel and then right here at the base, which makes sense because it is pretty dang thick right here at the base, and then it tapers in pretty dramatically, pretty quickly. So all in all, that makes for a sword that feels, it's very nimble, it's very quick, has pretty much no blade presence, does not feel like it's going to do any assistance in the cut for me. It feels like that's going to be completely on me. So something else I noticed that is just kind of interesting is that this sword does produce a good amount of sword wind. I'm sure you heard that. But a little bit weird there is that the sword wind, this is really going to be hard to explain. The sword wind sounds like it's coming just from the tip area and not from the whole blade. And I don't really know why that is. I know with other swords, when I hear the sword wind, it sounds like it's coming from more of the blade than this one does. This really sounds like it's just the tip that is causing that sword wind. That's probably why it's producing so much, because the tip gets accelerated quite well because of that long grip. You can really accelerate that tip. With the point of balance being back here, the lever points let you really accelerate the tip very easily. But it's just a little bit of an odd sound. It's very loud though, so it does help you with edge alignment. If we look at the percussion nodes on this sword, on the blade, it's right around here, right pretty much where you want it to be. And then in the hilt, it's pretty much right at the top of the grip. I do notice, don't know if you're going to pick that up, there's a very slight rattling noise when I do that. I'm not impacting this pommel much at all. Very slight rattling noise. I'm combined with the fact, like I mentioned earlier, the epoxy, the general construction of the way it's seated in the crossguard. I am continuing to be a little concerned that this may not have particularly great durability in keeping the crossguard tight, but that's more speculation than anything else. If we look at how flexible the blade is, it does flex some, but not a whole lot, and mostly in the later third of the blade. That's a good design there. It's got a pretty strong central ridge here, so it makes sense that it is pretty rigid, and it stays relatively thick throughout. Has good distal taper, but it's still 3.5 millimeters out this way, if I remember right. So it is definitely a rigid sword, and that's going to aid in the thrust. Maybe help some in the cut, but again, we talked about how the geometry here doesn't really aid in cutting. All right, I'm going to compare this Swordier sword to one other sword, and that is the Cold Steel Hand and a Half. And I chose this one because of the kind of similar hilt, and especially the grip length and all that. If we compare them here, hopefully that gets in the shot completely. You can see that the hilt lengths are relatively comparable. The blades are considerably different. The Cold Steel stays wider, and the Swordier definitely is a little bit thinner and overall a lighter blade. So immediately when I pick up this Cold Steel one, I immediately feel a vast difference in the weight distribution. This has a lot more weight out towards the tip and a lot more authority in the cut. I picked this sword specifically because in my last review of the Rhinelander, I talked about how this doesn't really feel like it handles much like long swords do, and I kind of feel the same way about the Swordier. So yeah, when moving this around, this feels like a tip-heavy longsword. Not too tip-heavy, but has weight out there, except that, again, the lever points don't feel quite right because the length of the grip is just so long. There's a lot of weight back here in the hilt, and the way it pivots around just feels a little bit awkward to me personally, the way I am used to handling swords. But it has a lot more weight out in the blade and a lot more authority in the cut. And when I switch from the Cold Steel to this Swordier, immediately I feel very little weight out here, a lot more weight back here towards the hilt, towards the pommel, much quicker. But the lever points remind me of the Cold Steel. The way this pivots and rotates reminds me very much of the way the Cold Steel does. Just different weight distribution, but again, long grip, long hilt, makes it feel a little bit different to me, not quite to my taste. That's not to say this is bad handling. It's just not quite to my taste. So what are some potential improvements that could be made to this sword to make it overall a little bit better? My first thing would be reduce the grip by 1 to 2 inches, get it down more into a true hand and a half dimension rather than the full-on long sword dimension it is. Secondly, honestly, potentially even the biggest thing would be refine the way the blade sits in the crossguard. I have a hunch that this is not going to be a very good long-term solution for the way it sits. Lastly, the edge could be brought a little bit sharper out of the box. The swords you get from Long Chuan, especially katana, usually have that final apexing done very well. This one could be improved, brought up to that standard a little bit better. All right, bottom line, this sword sold for around $250 when sword friend Frank ordered it. Is it worth that price? Well, first off, you could order one of these from some other sites, ones that look kind of shady to me, honestly, but the price that they're asking, around $450, not a chance. This sword is definitely not worth nearly double what Frank paid for it. But if you can find it for $250, is it worth that price? I think it really depends on what you're looking for. If you want a sword that is representative of what a European longsword is, no, that's not this sword. This is much more of a jian mounted to a longsword style hilt. If you're just looking for a sword that's fun to pick up, move around, and can aid you learning edge alignment, and it's just is pretty and something about it speaks to you, yeah, I could see this sword being worth it. For me personally, I don't think I would pay $250 for this. I don't particularly like the handling. I didn't enjoy cutting with it particularly. I do really like the shape of the grip, the way it feels. It locks the sword in the hand very nicely, but it doesn't really speak to me. And one other thing, sword friend Frank wanted to know if Swordier would deliver the sword as pictured. They did. They do seem to be a reputable seller of swords. So I can't endorse them all wholeheartedly. I didn't order this sword. One is not a significant example, but it is a data point in terms of saying that Swordier does deliver what they advertise. And that's going to wrap up this review. I want to say a huge thank you to Sword Friend Frank for loaning me this sword. It's going to be on its way back to you very soon. For everybody else, make sure you hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't. It really does help the channel continue to grow. Until next time, Alien Tude out.